Hello, people. It's October 12th, and here we are all again together, even, on the opposite sides of the screen for one more discussion around the most precious thing we have on us, our brain. I'm Pospo, and this is BRAINCAST. Last week, we closed our eyes and let ourselves go into the magic world of sleep with Dr. Guy Leschiner. We talked about parasomnias and the state of our consciousness when we fall asleep, but also the major link between sleep disturbance and mental health disorders. This week, we open our eyes to the brave new world of Ayahuasca. With us, an unstoppable clinical scientist with specific interest in transcultural psychiatry. To be honest, I think you could even call him a clinical activist, as he worked overseas with child soldiers in northern Uganda, but also following his passion in the use of psychedelic substances in the medical field. He spent the last not one, not two, not 3, 4 years conducting research into the use of ayahuasca in a traditional setting in the Peruvian Amazon, which, to be honest, sounds way more exciting than the usual London jungle that I am stuck in. He's currently finishing his PhD at the University of Goldsmiths here in London, so who better to talk about it, right? BRAINCAST people, this is Dr. Simon Ruffo. Simon, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks very much for that, Pospo.
Fantastic. Simon, what I find fascinating about humans is curiosity. What is this? What does this do? And, while for many things this is, pretty straightforward. Oh, there is this thing hanging up from the tree. I'll just go and eat it. And this is how bananas were discovered. For some others, though, it requires to go that extra mile. So what's the story behind ayahuasca?
I mean, that's quite a big question. Ayahuasca, put very simply, is a psychedelic brew that's used by indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest in order to connect with the divine and also to try and cure problems to do with health.
Who's knocking on the door? Just open them and let them in.
Someone's actually just started, I think, doing some repairs in the flat above me. Well, I said that wasn't happening when I started.
I thought I was hallucinating, but it seems that I'm still okay. I'm still okay. So they have been using it for a long time, right?
Well, this is unclear. It's definitely been used for at least a few hundred years. Ayahuasca seems to change with time and develop. It's likely that it's been used for thousands of years, but we can safely say it was being used for hundreds of years.
Wow, beautiful. I mean, what I find really interesting about ayahuasca is that it has that, air of mystery. And while I am a romantic guy, and I don't want to spoil it for people, but still, I can't help but ask, so what lies underneath this exotic name? What is ayahuasca made of, if you like?
Yeah, sure. So there are two basic parts of ayahuasca. There's the ayahuasca vine, and then there are leaves that contain the psychoactive, the psychedelic component, DMT. And those leaves are normally chacruna leaves. The vine actually contains MOAIs, so the old antidepressants, that we still use. And if you were to ingest ayahuasca, the leaves orally, normally, the DMT, the psychoactive component, would be broken down by enzymes in your stomach. And so the MOAIs in the ayahuasca vine prevent the DMT from being broken down. And this allows you to absorb it into your bloodstream, and then it goes into your brain and it exerts its psychedelic effects.
Wow. I doubt they knew that like 1,000 years ago. So that's the beauty of it. How did they decide to actually mix these two? I mean, I'm finding it really impressive. Anyway, so back in 2012, so Jaulio de Araujos, he used fMRI during a closed eyes imagery task in people under the influence of ayahuasca. Essentially, and I know I'm oversimplifying, they asked people to close their eyes and mentally generate the same image that they were shown a bit earlier. So what was impressive, was the fact that the ayahuasca produced stimulation of the primary visual cortex was comparable to the effect of natural images with the eyes open. Essentially, people were seeing with their eyes shut, with the authors in fact concluding that by boosting the intensity of imagination to the same level of the sensory perception of ayahuasca, lends a status, I didn't say all that, a quote, a status of reality to the inner experiences. So do you think that the visions, so is this central to ayahuasca's therapeutic effect?
This is a really interesting point, actually. So I think that ayahuasca has been growing in popularity amongst Westerners, and more people from the West have been either going to the Amazon rainforest to drink ayahuasca, or ayahuasca's been spreading across the rest of the world. And there seems to be an emphasis throughout people in the West that they want to see things, so they want to see the kind of the light show or whatever. When you speak to the indigenous, the shamans, about their use of ayahuasca, they certainly would say that the visual aspect was really important, but they wouldn't necessarily say it was the most important aspect. There's a lot of other things that effects that ayahuasca has that they put a lot of emphasis on. For example, the way it makes you feel inside, the emotions that it brings up, the thought patterns, things that you might even hear. And so visuals are one aspect, but not necessarily the most important.
Wow, okay. In 2018, so Palamo Fontes and his team, they published the first randomized placebo-controlled trial of ayahuasca in treatment-resistant depression. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
Yeah, this is the only randomized control trial looking at ayahuasca, and so what they did was they got 15 people, 30 people with treatment-resistant depression, and they gave 15 of them ayahuasca in a lab-based setting, and then they gave a placebo to the other 15. Now, ayahuasca is a thick, black, extremely bitter liquid that you drink. It's this brew. And other than having the effects we've just spoken about, the effects on the visual system and also your thoughts, it irritates the stomach lining and it makes you vomit a lot. And so what they did was to create, I don't know how they got ethics for this, but they made a thick black liquid that didn't have any psychoactive components. And all it did was irritate the stomach lining and make people sick and make them vomit. And so that was the comparison. And what they found is that there were statistically significant decreases in how depressed participants were immediately afterwards, and also maintained at 7 days when compared to the placebo. So it was a really nice study.
Wow, I mean, it sounds really good, but how can you ensure double blindness in a psychedelic trial? Now, for people not familiar with the term, a study is double blinded when neither the participants nor the clinicians know who is getting what. Am I getting ayahuasca? Am I getting the placebo? But to be honest, that must be pretty impossible with psychedelics, right? I mean, people are tripping out.
Yeah, it normally becomes quite obvious within about the first half an hour whether or not participants have got an active dose of a psychedelic substance or whether they've got a placebo. There are ways that people try and combat that. And so in the studies, I work in the psychedelics trials group here at King's, and in the studies that we do in psilocybin for our placebo group, we use what's called an active placebo, which is a very low dose of the psychedelic, and that's supposed to kind of go some way towards helping keep the blind. Normally, it's still fairly obvious within the first half an hour or so, but it's not. Sometimes it's not quite as obvious as you think. I mean, in the study we were just talking about with ayahuasca, I think there were 2 of the participants believed that they had active ayahuasca, and actually it was the placebo. So wow. It's the power of the placebo. Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, it's really obvious, nowadays that, placebo, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any effect. That's really interesting. Okay, another concern though that I have, and, it may sound a bit far-fetched, but, in this study, you have people, with treatment-resistant depression, which means that they've already been tried on several different depressants, at least 2. And some of them gives them ayahuasca. So part of which is an MOII, so a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So is there any risk for serotonin syndrome?
Yeah, this is another interesting point. So if you look at any of these retreat centers that use ayahuasca, one of the first things that they say is that you can't drink ayahuasca if you're taking any medication normally, but specifically not antidepressants, because of the risk of serotonin syndrome. And this actually comes from a study in the early 90s that suggested that ayahuasca could cause serotonin syndrome. The current thinking about it now is that that's actually not a risk. And that some of the effects that you get from ayahuasca, such as the sweating and sometimes the confusion, some of these things are actually part of the expected effects of ayahuasca, and they just sound a little bit like serotonin syndrome. There's also a view that serotonin syndrome is on a spectrum, and that you might have increased levels of serotonin for sure, but you might not have the full syndrome. So at the moment, the jury's out, and for all of our studies, we still say, don't take any antidepressants, don't take any medications, just to be sure. But there is some contention with that.
Fair enough. Neurotransmitter aside, though, there has been a heavy interest in the psychological processes that underlie the benefits of ayahuasca. In a really thorough paper, it took me a long time to read that, by Ptsd Frontiers. So your team talks about ayahuasca elevating repressed memories into consciousness, where they can play a role in psychological healing through restructuring. Now, if that doesn't sound psychoanalytic, then what does? I mean, does this mean that psychedelic are, how can I say it, are they the perfect synergistic example of psychopharmacology and psychotherapy? Can a psychedelic work without a psychotherapist's input?
Yeah, so with the majority of the trials that are being done in psychedelics at the moment, so again, the ones that we do at King's with Psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, there's a huge emphasis that's put on the psychological input, psychotherapy, before and afterwards. Normally at least 3 sessions once per week, before and afterwards, preparation and integration. That being said, the work that I do into, or that we do into ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest, they don't have psychotherapists, but they do have shamans, they do have curanderos, and they're available to talk to you before and after, and to talk to local people before and after they drink ayahuasca. I think that there is a risk if you don't have appropriate support before and after, that it could be quite confusing. The experience could be confusing, and it could even be quite traumatic if things come up and you don't know how to interpret them or what to do with that information. So I think the psychotherapeutic aspect is really, really important. I think it does obviously work without it, and I think that different populations do use psychotherapy, but maybe not in the way that we would label psychotherapy.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there was a paper in 2018 in Neuropharmacology. So they start the introduction by saying that, unlike other, the usual treatments that we use, like SSRIs, that seek to medicate patients with depression on a chronic basis. So the psychedelic model, like ayahuasca or psilocybin, they seek to treat, core psychological issues by a small number of profound and potentially, transformative psychological experiences. To be honest, it sounds like the opposite of PTSD. And although, it does sound great, but are all people ready for profound and transformative experiences, especially given that some trips can be unpredictable and can be also perceived as traumatic to some extent?
Yeah, I mean, these psychedelic trips can be very intense, and there's a very strict screening procedure for all of the studies that we do, and for pretty much all psychedelic studies that are going on at the moment, and for most of the retreat centers that use these substances too. So there are certain people, there are certain conditions that would immediately exclude you from these studies. And it could be quite dangerous, and that's the risk of developing psychosis. And those conditions include previous histories of psychotic illnesses, potentially family histories of psychotic illnesses, personality disorders, things like that. I think there's that aside, it's also down to the person as to whether or not they're ready to delve into, yeah, potentially quite traumatic experiences that they've had. So it's definitely not for everyone.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's a fair point. And although there is nowadays some evidence that psychedelics, ayahuasca included, it can be helpful to treat mental health disorders, they do remain illegal, for a lack of a better word. Yeah. Now, back in 2018, Prof. Nat assembled a team of experts and essentially attempted to provide a different framework around drug policy. But what I found really interesting is that at some point they mentioned the phrase drug policy in a Western context, implying that drug policies may be investigated under a different light in alternative contexts / cultures. So how does culture affect drug policy, you think?
Oh, I think in a really clear way with ayahuasca, it's the way that the substances are perceived. So, for example, when you think about ayahuasca in South America in an indigenous context, it wouldn't be perceived as a drug at all. It would be perceived as a medicine, and it's completely legal there. It's legal in many countries throughout South America. However, if you look at DMT, the active component, dimethyltryptamine, in the UK and many places around Europe, then it's Class A, it's Schedule 1. And I think that's due to the way that you perceive that substance. It's also probably worth mentioning here that there's some interesting kind of debate coming up against the war on drugs, where a lot of these substances were made illegal, specifically psychedelics, and it's been suggested that perhaps that wasn't quite as clear cut as we may think due to risk, and it might have had some political things kind of that led to the scheduling of psilocybin and other psychedelics. And so, for example, in the US, there were many people who were taking psychedelics and started deciding that they didn't want to go to the Vietnamese War, and that potentially could have been one of the reasons that psychedelics were made illegal then as well. So I think there's a lot to think about, and it's not clear cut.
Simon, I remember some time ago we bumped into each other, and you were telling me back then about your plans to travel to the Peruvian Amazon to study the use of ayahuasca. And I was like, what the heck is she talking about? But you actually did it. So I want to hear all about it. This is the time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. There's three of us who are doing this research together. There's Nigel Band, who's a psychologist working in Bristol, and then another psychologist called Weifeng Sang, who's actually based here at King's as well. And about 5 years ago, we decided that we wanted to research ayahuasca in retreat settings, because no one else seemed to be doing that, and we couldn't believe it. And there were people with lots of anecdotal evidence, anecdotal reports saying that they've been really helped by ayahuasca. And so, quite unsurprisingly, when we first started, nobody wanted to fund our initial research, which wasn't really that surprising. So we funded it ourselves, and we published that research, and that led to the next thing, which led to the next thing, and then we managed to get some money from the Medical Research Council and managed to keep starting new projects, and now we actually have a research centre in the Amazon rainforest called Riospo, which is part of the Ayahuasca Foundation. If you want to have a look at it, then we have a website as well. And the journey continues, and it's been amazing.
But so did you go actually? It's in the jungle, or is it, let's say, like going, I don't know, to Hampstead Heath?
No, it's properly in the jungle. So it's So to get to the nearest city, you can't get there by road. You have to get there either by air or by boat. And then when you get to that city, it's called Iquitos, which is in the Amazon rainforest. You then have to get another boat, where you get a truck as far as you can go until the trees get too thick, and then you get another boat for a few hours down the Amazon rainforest. And then our research center is based in an indigenous community called Mashana, which is right in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. So, Pospo, if you'd like to come out and visit, you're always more than welcome, man. As soon as the world begins to open up again.
Maybe I shouldn't go to Greece next summer. Maybe I should come and visit your retreat. But you know what, man?
The offer's open.
So reading from someone else's first-hand experience by ayahuasca, he was saying that, I'm going to quote, so now that I've had some time to think about it, so this guy tried ayahuasca for a few days, and then he was just, sharing his experience. He says, now that I've had some time to think about it, I'd say ayahuasca is the best and the worst thing I've ever done. I spent a week staring down all my bullshit and all my insecurities, and it was totally liberating. But it was also terrifying and not something I want or need to see again. So tell me about your personal experience with ayahuasca.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who's drunk ayahuasca would probably say a similar thing initially. It seems quite funny that people would kind of label it as a recreational substance in Europe, because it's probably the least. It's not recreational at all. It's like doing a year of psychotherapy kind of squashed into a few hours. Wow. So it's incredibly intense, incredibly illuminating, and definitely not something to be taken lightly.
Wow. Okay. And I mean, for people that are hearing, do not try at home.
I mean, well, definitely don't try it here because it's illegal. But if you were thinking about going to South America to drink it, my advice would be if you're going to, make sure you're doing it with people that you trust, and definitely not something to mess around with, for sure.
But can you tell me, I mean, as briefly as you can, what's the actual process? So, with the brew and the shaman and all that. So how does this all work? If you
So when you do it in a traditional setting, you would normally drink ayahuasca in a what's called a maloca, which is a little kind of hut temple structure. And then you would have a shaman sitting in the center, who also drinks ayahuasca, and then about 10 people are sitting around in this circular hut, all drinking ayahuasca. And then when the effects of ayahuasca begin to hit, the shaman would start chanting songs. Excuse me, they're called icaros. And the shamans believe that channels spirits. And then they would start to do work on you using these chants and using what they see in you when they're under the influence of ayahuasca.
Wow, thank you. I found the paper back in 2005. So it was Evelyn Silveira. So she mentions that the ritual use of ayahuasca, essentially, I would expect that it's something similar to what you just described. So that the ritual use of ayahuasca within the context of the Brazilian ayahuasca churches, they often start during late childhood or early adolescence, so pretty early. Now, what I found really interesting, so she said that premature access to psychoactive drugs may represent a risk factor for drug misuse. Conversely, religious affiliation seems to play a protective role in terms of the substance abuse. So what are the dangers of using a traditional medication like ayahuasca outside of its context?
Yeah, I think if you're using ayahuasca outside of its context, you're going to have to be really, really careful. I mean, there are lots of case reports of people being hurt either physiologically or psychologically as a result of ayahuasca. If you just Google it, it will come up with all these kind of these shock stories. And I think that people who have been working with ayahuasca for a very long time, hundreds, if not thousands of years, to figure out safe ways of doing so. So when you start using it outside of that context, and people start trying to brew it themselves, I think there's a risk of it going quite badly wrong. And so I would definitely caution against that. There's also issues to do with cultural appropriation as well. I think if we're taking ayahuasca outside of its context, then we need to be really careful to to respect where it came from, and to give credit where credit's due. And that's something I think that we need to think very, very carefully about as we see the spread of ayahuasca.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because, as I was preparing for this discussion, I Googled ayahuasca travel, and I was shocked. I mean, there is a whole industry relying on Westerners looking for healing. And whilst, I can see the financial benefits, for the Peruvians, are there any dangers of a sudden influx of Western culture in traditional settings?
For sure. I think as a result of that, there's been lots of I guess, fake shamans who have appeared with fake ayahuasca, which, I mean, you kind of understand why that would happen. There's a huge influx of Westerners into historically quite a poor place and bringing lots of money. And so there's become this huge ayahuasca industry. And there are many people who, like we spoke about earlier, Pospo, who believe that the Westerners just want the visual effects, and so they'll try and brew something that's very hallucinogenic, potent hallucinogenics, which can be very, very dangerous. And and these shamans don't have the appropriate training. So unlike here in the UK, where you get qualifications for training in medicine or psychology or whatever, there's nothing like that in Peru. There's no kind of verification process. But to train as a shaman, it's like medicine. It takes a good 10 years before you can start doing ceremonies by yourself. And so it's led to, there's been a fair few deaths, and I'm sure lots of other traumatic experiences that have happened as a result of this. So that's one of the dangers for sure.
You know what, Simon? I would love to see, head-to-head comparisons in trials of, LSD versus psilocybin versus ayahuasca, or maybe versus, the traditional medication that we use, on our daily lives. So is that part of your future research plans?
I would love to do that too. I mean, I think that would probably be quite difficult. What we're working towards at the moment, I'm really looking forward to, is giving ayahuasca to people with PTSD, veterans with PTSD in the rainforest. And we've actually teamed up with a charity called Heroic Hearts, who do just that. And so we're making plans potentially to try and start a study focusing on that. But I'll keep you posted.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Simon. Dr. Simon Raphael, BRAINCAST people. You'll certainly be hearing way more of him in the years to come. Enough, though, with trips and visions. Next week, we're going to take a closer look and focus on the most exciting thing in your brain, glutamate, our brain's excitatory neurotransmitter. Expect neuroscience, neuroimaging, and how this may change the future of our patients. With me, one of the most up-and-coming scientists in the field, Dr. Kate Merritt from UCL. Yes, I know, there is life beyond King's College, I know. And on that note, Pospo and BRAINCAST for Monthly Learning, over and out.